Now, the holiday season is usually seen as a time of joy and love, but for many people, it is also a time of loneliness. Some people also feel emotionally distant from the people they're with, which can result in feeling lonely even when in a room of people that you love. We are joined by clinical psychologist Shareeka Angamani to explain how individuals can deal with loneliness during the pandemic. Shareeka, thank you so much for joining us. Really appreciate it. Let's start with the more clinical question. What is loneliness? Is it a medical condition? Is it I'm alone, so I decide I'm alone? Or is there something more to the idea of loneliness?
So loneliness is understood as basically a lack of social connectedness. So, I often get asked, what's the difference between loneliness and depression? Isn't it the same thing? But it's actually quite different because loneliness focuses more on the social pain that you feel from the lack of intimate relationships, from the lack of meeting your personal needs in terms of person to person interaction. So, the need for social connection is so similar to our need for food, for water, for sleep. It's a similar connection because we are social beings. So loneliness is basically when those needs are not being met. So basically, like for example, depression on the other hand is a much more generalized feeling of sadness. It can be related to a whole bunch of facets of your life, whether it's work or family. But loneliness is specifically a social construct. It's that need to connect with people that often doesn't get met during the festive season, especially this year, I think.
Yeah, Maslow had that quite high up in his hierarchy. But let's take a look now what the results of loneliness can be. So, for instance, there are certain social phenomena that lead to a spike, say, in suicide, for instance. During university exams, for instance, you will see a spike in attempts of suicide and actual suicide during an exam season. Similarly, during the festive season across the Christmas period, you'll see more calls going to suicide hotlines, more attempts at suicide, and sometimes more suicide itself. Is that a direct result of loneliness, or is there something else to it?
So I think, especially with the festive season, and I would, go as far as to say, particularly this year, the festive season, we are on social media, we're watching movies, there's a lot of festive movies going around, things like that, and we listen to specific types of songs that are playing on the radio, and it all gives us this idea of how the festive season is supposed to look. It's this time of merriment, it's this time of families being together and supporting one another in this time, sharing gifts, etc., etc. So the festive season in particular can be very, very lonely because this idea that we get about what the festive season is supposed to look like tends to put a lot of social pressure. So in this year in particular, when there's a lot of restrictions, there's a lot of social distancing happening, it can really impact how we feel lonely during this time. So I think there is definitely a correlation between the loneliness that we feel now and then depression and obviously suicidal tendencies if those needs are not met or if you don't find compensation strategies to deal with the loneliness.
Under normal circumstances, the obvious answer to the question on loneliness would be hey, just spend some time with family and friends, perhaps even your neighbors. But these are not normal circumstances. So, what do we do then? How do we connect on an interpersonal level then? How do we overcome loneliness given that there's a cost barrier to spending time with people? If we're going to be on Zoom, for instance, if I don't have the facilities, I can't do that. What then is the solution?
Okay, so there's quite a few strategies in place, but I think first and foremost, it's very important that we normalize feeling loneliness during this time. We have to validate that it's absolutely normal to feel frustrated if you can't go and visit family members, or if you are feeling lonely and you don't feel like that connection, and maybe you're afraid to go out and go and put yourself out there, going to to a coffee shop and things like that. It's absolutely normal during this time to feel very, very lonely and to feel frustrated with our current situation. So even though the holiday season may look very different this year, I think a slight change in perspective can really make loneliness manageable, not take it away completely, but it can definitely make it manageable. So during this time, we try to reframe what the holiday season looks like. So often, if we're hosting big Christmas parties or if we're planning to visit family in other provinces, it can become very taxing in terms of your budget, in terms of your stress. If you've got kids that you need to take around, things like that. So we try to frame this, or at least the way that I've been trying to work with my patients who are experiencing loneliness loneliness is by saying, let's try and look at the alternative. The alternative is that it's a low budget time of year. Maybe when we're spending less money because we're not hosting Christmas parties. We are spending time with our intimate family members. We are keeping things small and intimate, and that's also okay. So because we're bombarded with what it's supposed to look like, a slight reframe can really make a difference. And then there's the more practical stuff that you can do. You mentioned the technology aspect of it, and sometimes it's possible, sometimes it's not, but reaching out even for a phone call does make a difference. And I think if it's possible also, a lot of people have gone and have really suffered financially during this time, have really suffered in terms of not seeing their family members. So for example, old age homes, things like that. Doing some sort of volunteer work also takes the focus from your inward struggling and suffering, and kind of gives you something else to focus on, someone else's happiness, and that can really be quite rewarding. And then there's also management tips in terms of practicing self-care, taking up a hobby during this time, journaling, exercising, just going out, getting out of your space. So your space can maybe be quite lonely. If you're at home, you're sitting in your lounge, the loneliness can be quite acute at that time. So if you take yourself out of there, you go and you change your environment, you go for a walk, go sit in a park, that also makes a difference to the kind of levels of loneliness that you experience. Just by seeing different places, by speaking to a waiter, for example, ordering some food, obviously, social distance and all of that, taking all of that into consideration, but that all makes a difference. So it's kind of just about putting these strategies in place physically, so going out, but also trying to reframe what this time of the year means to you and what it looks like to you.
Now, of course, to reframe and what loneliness is, to reframe the time and to normalize loneliness requires some sort of psychosocial adjustment that needs to happen on a communal level. Collectively, as a society, we need to make that sort of adjustment. But it also means we need to be cognizant that other people might be lonely and perhaps reach out to them. Now, I'm a very socially awkward person. What should I do if I notice somebody might be lonely? If I know there's a neighbor in my building somewhere or down my street that might be lonely, how do I reach out to them if I intend to do so? Given the fact that I don't think I'm very good, breaking the ice.
So, it doesn't have to necessarily be this social interaction where you go and knock on someone's door and strike up a conversation. It can be simple things like, if you go and you buy something, you buy a packet of biscuits or something like that, and you just go and drop it off with a little, leave it at their door, knock on the door and leave kind of thing. We're thinking of you. This is a difficult time for everyone, writing a personal note, things like that to a neighbor. If you stay in a complex, for example, having some sort of, I think I noticed this on social media once. There was people were having braais, social distance braais, even there were people on their own, but it was all happening within a complex. So it was something that was organized on social media, and I think it was in a WhatsApp group, and everybody came out and had their own individual braais on their lawn, but it was a communal thing that happened. So kind of trying to organize these things. If you're stuck at home on your own and you do have some touch with your neighbors, it does make a difference to reach out with a gift or something like that to kind of break the ice. It does make a difference, but that does come with a financial cost. But even a small personal note, anything like that, or starting a WhatsApp group, those, technology can really be your best friend when it comes to loneliness.
Earlier on, you mentioned activities such as taking a walk to the park, to the grocery store, or just having a chat with a waiter or someone you might walk across in the street. Those are possible tools one can use to overcome some sort of loneliness if you are experiencing that. But what is to be done in the instance if you're not able to take a walk? What if your loneliness seems to peak in the middle of the night when it's quiet and it's just you and your thoughts? We're in a curfew, you can't take a walk then. What sort of solutions are available in the quiet hours of the night when your thoughts are as loud as they can ever be?
So I think when it comes to, those periods of time where you don't have these external things to distract you, you might not be able, you might not feel like watching a movie or turning on the TV or anything like that. You might kind of just be sitting with your thoughts, like you mentioned. I find that in those times, doing some form of meditation, some form of mindfulness, journaling, all those types of things, they do tend to really, really make a difference. But people tend to do it very sporadically. So they'll do it when they're feeling lonely. So in the moment you're feeling that way and you want to kind of start writing down your feelings. It doesn't really work like that. Mental health and dealing with these types of issues is a it's a kind of a long-term approach. So for example, if you realize that this up until New Year's and past New Year's, I'm going to be alone, this is a great time to take up something like meditation. It makes all the difference when you can quiet your mind, when you can gain control over your racing thoughts or your overthinking, and kind of put the brakes on your own train of thought. It makes all the difference to managing the emotions that come with these negative thoughts. So for example, let's think about journaling. Journaling is often overlooked tremendously because people think of a teenager sitting and writing, "Dear diary, this happened today," but that's not what journaling is. Journaling is an introspective process. It's something to think about. You use journal prompts. So if you start writing down your feelings, you use things like, what happened today that made me feel lonely in particular? Was I missing a particular person? And these are the kind of thoughts that you think about and you write down, because getting it out and putting it onto paper also makes it more tangible. So it's not on repeat, on loop on your head, in your head. It's there, it's on paper, it's tangible for you. So those are kind of the things that you can put in place, but it takes time. It doesn't just happen in that moment. It's something that you should start if you feel like you're going to be someone who's particularly vulnerable to feeling very lonely during this time.
Now, loneliness during this season, like I said earlier, is different to all other times. All other times we weren't dealing with a pandemic. Now we're dealing with a pandemic. Someone might be alone, but at the same time grieving the loss of a loved one to the pandemic. We've seen record numbers of deaths recorded this week. We've seen record numbers of new infections. We will continue to see that over the next coming weeks. So if you're alone and grieving, the loneliness is just that much higher. It's amplified. And it's a special circumstance for you because grieving itself requires time, it requires certain mental and psychological resources, and it can feel too daunting of a task to do all by yourself during this particular period. What do you say to someone who finds himself in that particular circumstance?
So grief in particular, I think it's a complex process. Like you mentioned, it's it's kind of, there's no fast forward button to grief. It's a process that you have to go through. If you've lost someone now to COVID-19, or for any other reason, and you've lost someone, it's so important to give yourself the time to really feel, really process. If you cry, you need to cry, you need to talk about it to whoever's around you, if there are family members. But you mentioned in particular, if you're alone during this time, so say for example you were living with your spouse, and your spouse is someone who passed away with COVID or for any other reason, especially during this time, it's so important to look out for signs of depression. So if you start noticing that it's going beyond feeling sad and crying, it's going to the point where you're not eating, you're not sleeping, you can't concentrate on anything, you don't want to even leave your house to get your groceries. It kind of goes from the regular grief process. I don't even think there is anything like a regular grief process, but there's kind of the expected feelings. And then if you notice that it's going on for a longer period of time and you are falling into a depression, it's so important to reach out to professionals. People often think, because it's COVID, there's no resources available. There are so many resources available during this time. There's the suicide crisis line, that's a government line that's free of charge. There's Lifeline, the South African Depression Anxiety Group. A lot of psychologists are offering online sessions at this time for people who are maybe isolating and can't reach out. All those resources are so important to have on hand because it makes a difficult process like grief manageable, especially if you don't have your regular coping skills that you would use, because our funerals are not the same. The way that we mourn losses, we would usually go to a person's house and there would be the mourning rituals that accompany, or prayers and things like that. We don't have that right now. So it's so important to find resources, professional resources, if you don't have the relationship resources that you would usually have. And it's so important because there's a lot of free resources as well available to help you cope if you're struggling in that sense.